This seat is reserved for premium passengers, and please get to another cabin.
When the flight attendant shouted at him, the entire cabin went silent. Passengers stopped reading their newspapers. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the businessman seated across the aisle slowly lowered his coffee cup. The young woman in the blue uniform stood in the center of the Boeing 707, with one hand on her hip and the other pointing directly at a broad-shouldered passenger sitting quietly by the window. To everyone watching, it looked like another argument between airline staff and a difficult traveler. But there was one problem. The man she was scolding wasn't arguing. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't demanding special treatment. He simply sat there listening while dozens of strangers watched him being embarrassed in public. And within the next 2 hours, that same flight attendant would discover she had made a mistake she would remember for the rest of her life. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today and how old you are. Leave your location and age in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach around the world. Now let's go back to September of 1967, when a routine flight from Chicago to Los Angeles turned into a lesson that nobody on board would ever forget. September 1967, Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The city was waking beneath a blanket of low clouds drifting inland from Lake Michigan. Inside Terminal 2, the airport felt like a world of its own. Hundreds of passengers moved through the concourse carrying briefcases, newspapers, garment bags, and steaming cups of coffee. Airline announcements echoed overhead every few minutes while jet engines rumbled outside beyond the terminal windows. Air travel still possessed a certain elegance in those days. Men wore jackets and polished shoes. Women traveled in dresses and hats. Flying wasn't something people took for granted. It felt important. Near Gate 14, a tall man sat quietly reading a newspaper. He wore a plain white shirt beneath a dark sport coat. No bodyguards stood nearby. No reporters followed him. Nobody asked for an autograph. Most travelers passed without giving him a second glance. The man seemed perfectly content with that. His name, though almost nobody recognized him that morning, was John Wayne. At 60 years old, he was one of the most famous actors in the world. Yet on that particular day, he looked less like a movie star and more like a tired businessman heading home after a long trip. Wayne had spent several days in Chicago attending charity events and meetings before returning to California. Despite his fame, he often preferred traveling quietly whenever possible. He enjoyed observing ordinary people. He enjoyed conversations that had nothing to do with Hollywood. Most of all, he enjoyed the rare moments when nobody knew who he was. Several seats away stood another passenger waiting patiently to board. His name was Walter Henderson, 72 years old, a widower, a retired railroad worker from Decatur, Illinois. He carried a worn leather suitcase and walked with a slight limp caused by injuries sustained decades earlier during military service. Walter wasn't accustomed to flying. In fact, he had spent most of his life avoiding it because he simply couldn't afford airline tickets. This journey was different. His daughter Ruth lived in California and had finally convinced him to visit after nearly 3 years apart. She had purchased the ticket herself and mailed it to him with a handwritten note that read, "Dad, the grandchildren are getting too old to wait another year." Walter carried that letter folded neatly inside his jacket pocket. He had read it so many times the paper was beginning to wear thin along the creases. Like many men of his generation, Walter wasn't comfortable showing emotion. Yet every few minutes, he found himself touching the pocket just to make sure the letter was still there. The trip meant more to him than anyone around him could possibly understand. Standing near the boarding gate was Susan Parker, 27 years old, smart, professional, ambitious. Her blue airline uniform was perfectly pressed. Her posture was flawless. Her supervisors considered her one of the company's most promising young flight attendants. Susan took enormous pride in efficiency. Flights should depart on time. Passengers should follow instructions. Problems should be solved immediately. Most days, those qualities made her excellent at her job. Unfortunately, after a difficult week filled with delays, complaints, and schedule changes, patience was becoming harder to find. By the time boarding began, she was already frustrated. One family had misplaced their tickets. Another passenger was arguing about baggage restrictions. A businessman insisted his briefcase required special storage. None of these issues were serious, but together they created the kind of stress that slowly wears down good judgment. Susan smiled professionally through all of it, Yet beneath the surface, her patience was running dangerously low. That would matter very soon. When boarding finally started, passengers formed a line stretching halfway down the concourse. Susan scanned tickets quickly, barely looking up as travelers passed through the gate. Then John Wayne stepped forward and handed her his boarding pass. She glanced at it, then at him, then back at the ticket. Something about the situation immediately felt wrong to her. The boarding pass indicated a premium cabin seat near the front of the aircraft. Yet the man standing before her didn't look like the type of passenger she expected to see there. His clothes were simple. His luggage was modest. He wasn't carrying himself like an executive or wealthy traveler. Instead of checking the passenger manifest carefully, Susan trusted her first impression. It was a small mistake, the kind people make every day, but small mistakes often create big consequences. Wayne noticed her hesitation. "Everything all right?" he asked politely. Susan forced a smile. "Just a moment, sir." She examined the ticket again, then handed it back and allowed him to continue boarding. Yet the doubt remained in her mind. As passengers filled the Boeing 707, Wayne located his assigned seat near the front of the cabin and settled beside the window. Outside, baggage crews loaded luggage while airport vehicles crossed the tarmac beneath the gray Chicago sky. A few rows farther back, Walter Henderson struggled to place his suitcase in the overhead compartment. Nobody offered assistance. Nobody seemed to notice. Eventually, he managed it himself and lowered into his seat, breathing slightly harder than before. A few minutes later, Susan entered the cabin carrying the passenger manifest. She moved through the rows performing final checks until she reached Wayne's seat. Then she stopped. She looked at the seat number. She looked at the manifest. Then she looked directly at him. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" Wayne folded his newspaper and handed it over. Susan studied it briefly before shaking her head. "I believe you're seated in the wrong section." Several nearby passengers glanced up. Wayne remained calm. "I don't think so." Susan's expression tightened. "This seat is reserved for premium passengers." Wayne pointed gently toward the ticket in her hand. "That's where the ticket says I'm supposed to sit." Susan barely looked. She had already convinced herself she was right. "Sir, I need you to move to the rear cabin until we sort this out." The businessman across the aisle lowered his coffee cup. Another passenger removed his glasses to watch more closely. Wayne stayed polite. "If there's a mistake, perhaps we should verify it first." Susan's voice became noticeably louder. "Sir, you're delaying departure." Now the entire section was listening. "Please cooperate." The cabin fell silent. Nobody wanted to be involved. Nobody wanted confrontation. Wayne looked around briefly, then stood. Without argument. Without complaint. He collected his bag and followed Susan down the aisle while dozens of passengers watched. Some assumed he had done something wrong. Others simply felt uncomfortable. Susan directed him toward an empty seat near the rear of the aircraft and returned to the front without another word. The engines began to roar outside as the aircraft prepared for departure. What Susan didn't know was that the seat assignment had been correct all along. What John Wayne didn't know was that the worst part of the story was still ahead. Before we continue, type respect in the comments if you believe people should never be judged by appearance alone, because what happened next would change the entire atmosphere of that flight. John Wayne stepped into the aisle and knelt beside Walter Henderson without hesitation. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't make a speech. He simply got down on one knee and began gathering the scattered items from the carpet. The first thing he picked up was a medal. He brushed it gently with his thumb before placing it back into the leather case. Then another. Then another. The passengers nearest the aisle leaned forward to see what had fallen. A Purple Heart. A campaign medal. Service ribbons worn smooth by decades of careful handling. Wayne found an old photograph beneath a seat and handed it to Walter. "You served?" he asked quietly. Walter nodded. "France. Long time ago." Wayne studied the photograph for a moment. A much younger Walter stood beside several soldiers beneath a bright European sky. "Looks like a lifetime ago." Walter smiled sadly. "Feels like it too." Wayne retrieved the folded American flag next. Instead of simply placing it back into the case, he carefully refolded it, corner by corner, the way it was meant to be folded. Several veterans later said they remembered that moment more clearly than anything else. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was respectful. When everything had been gathered, Wayne secured the case, stood up, placed it safely back into the overhead compartment, and checked the latch twice. Then he turned toward Susan Parker. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable for the first time all day. Wayne didn't raise his voice. He didn't embarrass her the way she had embarrassed him and Walter. He simply said, "Some things deserve a little more time." The words hung in the air. Simple. Calm. Impossible to argue with. At that exact moment, the cockpit door opened and Captain Robert Ellis stepped into the cabin. He had come back to check on the turbulence report and was halfway down the aisle when he noticed the tall man standing beside Walter Henderson. The captain stopped immediately. His expression changed from routine professionalism to complete surprise. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he smiled. "Mr. Wayne?" The entire cabin turned. Conversations ended instantly. Passengers looked from the captain to the man standing beside the veteran. A wave of whispers spread through the aircraft. Suddenly, everyone saw what they had somehow missed all afternoon. The face, the voice, the presence. Susan Parker felt her stomach drop. Every interaction replayed inside her head at once. The boarding pass, the seat change, the public correction, the dismissive treatment, the embarrassment. She had spent hours treating one of the most recognizable men in America like he didn't belong on the airplane. Captain Ellis approached quickly. "Mr. Wayne, why didn't you tell anyone you were on board?" Wayne shrugged slightly. "Didn't seem important." The captain immediately apologized and offered to move him back into his original premium seat. He promised complimentary service and assured him the airline would address the situation properly. Wayne listened patiently before shaking his head. "No need." The captain seemed confused. "Sir, after the way you've been treated." Wayne glanced toward Walter Henderson sitting quietly beside the window with the leather case resting in his lap. Then he looked back at the captain. "If you want to fix something, start there." The entire cabin fell silent again. Susan lowered her eyes. In that moment, she understood exactly what he meant. For the next hour, the atmosphere aboard the Boeing 707 changed completely. Susan walked back to Walter Henderson's row and sat beside him. Not because she had been told to, not because John Wayne was famous, because she finally realized how poorly she had treated someone she knew nothing about. She apologized sincerely. Then she asked about the medals. Walter told her about France, about coming home, about Dorothy, about raising his daughter alone after losing his wife. For the first time all day, Susan stopped rushing and actually listened. Nearby passengers listened too. Some learned more from that conversation than they had from years of history classes. John Wayne returned to his seat and never mentioned the incident again. He didn't seek attention. He didn't enjoy being the center of the story. In fact, whenever another passenger tried thanking him, he redirected the conversation back toward Walter. By the time the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, many passengers felt as though they knew the old veteran personally. The same cabin that had watched him being embarrassed now treated him with admiration. The Boeing 707 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport beneath bright California sunshine. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering luggage and preparing to leave. Then something unexpected happened. A businessman near the front started clapping. Another joined him. Then another. Within seconds, applause spread through the cabin. At first, most people looked toward John Wayne. Wayne immediately pointed toward Walter Henderson. The applause shifted. Walter looked stunned. For years, he had moved through life unnoticed by most of the world. Now an entire airplane was standing in appreciation of sacrifices he rarely spoke about. Several passengers shook his hand before leaving. One veteran embraced him. Another thanked him for his service. When the cabin finally emptied, Walter stood beside his seat and extended his hand toward John Wayne. "I'll never forget this," he said. Wayne smiled. "Don't remember me." Walter looked confused. Wayne nodded toward the leather case. "Remember what's inside there." Then he picked up his bag, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit. No photographers waited. No grand farewell followed. Within minutes, he disappeared into the crowd just as quietly as he had appeared that morning in Chicago. Years later, Susan Parker would tell new flight attendants a story she never attached names to. She simply told them this: "You never know who is sitting in that seat. You never know what they've survived, what they've sacrificed, or what they carry with them. Treat every passenger accordingly." It became a lesson she repeated for the rest of her career. As for Walter Henderson, he spent 6 wonderful weeks with his daughter and grandchildren in California. The leather case remained beside him until the end of his life. And John Wayne never mentioned the flight publicly. He never took credit. He never turned it into a story about himself. Because for him, it was never about fame. It was about respect. The kind of respect every person deserves, whether they're famous or forgotten. If this story meant something to you, type "respect for all" in the comments along with your location. And if you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and the people who quietly make the world better, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.